The ad was simple. Roommate wanted, spacious apartment, affordable rent, utilities included, must be quiet, non-smoker, no pets. David read it twice. He was fresh out of college, drowning in student debt, and just starting a new job. Finding a cheap place near downtown was nearly impossible, and this one seemed perfect. He messaged the poster, a guy named Paul, and got a response almost immediately. They agreed to meet the following evening for a tour. David arrived at the address, a worn but charming brick building. As he knocked on the door, he noted the quiet neighborhood, almost unnervingly silent. Paul opened the door with a wide, friendly smile. He was in his early 30s, neatly dressed, and had a calm presence. "Come on in," Paul said, stepping aside. David entered and was surprised at how clean and modern the apartment looked inside, compared to the slightly decaying exterior. They walked through the place, and David noticed there were hardly any personal items. The decor was minimalist, a few pieces of furniture, a coffee table, and a spotless kitchen. When they reached the guest bedroom, David found it perfectly bare, save for a bed and a small dresser. "So what do you think?" Paul asked, leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed. "It's great," David replied. "Just what I was looking for." Paul nodded, his smile never fading. "I think you'll be a great fit. We can start with a month-to-month agreement. See how it goes." It all seemed too easy, but David wasn't about to question his luck. They shook hands, and David agreed to move in the following week. On his first night, David noticed how quiet the apartment was. No sounds from the street, no neighbors' voices, just silence. It was unnerving, but he shrugged it off, thinking it would be something he'd get used to. For the first few weeks, everything went smoothly. Paul was hardly ever home. When he was polite, kept to himself, and often went to bed early. They rarely interacted beyond polite nods and casual greetings. But as the days passed, David started noticing little things that made him uneasy. One night, he was brushing his teeth when he heard the soft creak of footsteps outside the bathroom. He paused, his toothbrush in midair, and listened. The footsteps stopped, and everything was silent again. David shook it off, assuming it was Paul passing by on his way to the kitchen. But then it happened again. Every night for a week, David heard the same soft creaks, always just outside his door or the bathroom, and they always stopped as soon as he noticed. His imagination ran wild. He thought about asking Paul if he was pacing at night, but didn't want to sound paranoid. One night, unable to sleep, David decided to go for a walk to clear his head. He tiptoed down the hallway, careful not to wake Paul. But as he passed Paul's bedroom, he glanced through the slightly open door and froze. The room was empty. The bed was untouched, perfectly made, as if no one had slept in it for days. A chill ran down his spine. He hadn't heard Paul leave, and he certainly hadn't seen him come back. He walked quietly back to his room, closed the door, and locked it. His mind raced with questions. Where was Paul going every night? Why was he leaving the apartment without saying anything? The next day, David couldn't shake his discomfort. He worked up the courage to confront Paul that evening. When Paul returned, David casually asked, "Hey, I noticed you're out pretty late sometimes. Do you work nights or something?" Paul gave him a strange look, a small, knowing smile creeping onto his face. "I have my routines. They're personal." He didn't elaborate, and the cryptic response only deepened David's unease. As the weeks went on, the late-night creaking continued, sometimes growing louder. One night, David woke up to the sound of his own bedroom door creaking open. He sat up in bed, heart pounding, and saw a dark silhouette standing in the doorway. "Paul?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, silent and unmoving, watching him. David was paralyzed, his breath caught in his throat. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the figure turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness. David couldn't sleep after that. He lay awake, listening to every sound, every creak, every rustle. The next morning, he packed a bag. He was done. Whatever was going on, he didn't want to be part of it. As he was leaving, he spotted Paul in the hallway. He avoided eye contact, mumbling something about leaving for a few days to visit family. Paul simply nodded, that eerie smile still on his face. David checked into a motel across town, intending to look for a new apartment the next day. He lay in bed, exhausted but relieved to be away from that apartment. Finally, he drifted off to sleep. In the middle of the night, his phone buzzed. Groggy, he reached for it and squinted at the screen. It was a text message from Paul. "Miss you already, David." Chills ran down his spine. He stared at the message, his hands trembling, when a second message came through. Did you really think you could leave? Heart pounding, David bolted up, threw on his clothes, and grabbed his bag. As he stumbled to his car, his phone buzzed again. A new message popped up, this time with an image attached. He opened it reluctantly, and his blood ran cold. It was a photo of him, sleeping in his motel bed, taken just moments ago. In a panic, he called the police, trying to explain everything that had happened, but they dismissed it as a prank, claiming they'd look into it in the morning. Shaken, David drove to a friend's house and crashed on their couch, constantly checking over his shoulder. The next day, he returned to the apartment to collect the rest of his belongings, hoping Paul wouldn't be there. But when he arrived, he found the place deserted. Paul's room was empty, stripped bare, as if he had never been there. Even stranger, David found a piece of mail on the counter addressed to him. Confused, he opened it. Inside was a single piece of paper with an old photograph attached. It was a photo of himself standing in that very apartment, taken from behind. Beneath it was a short note in Paul's handwriting. "We never really leave, David. We just become part of the story." David's knees went weak. There was no way that photo could exist, because he had never actually moved in. The memory of the past month felt real, yet it started unraveling in his mind. The ad, the apartment, even Paul himself, each memory grew fainter, like a shadow fading with the light. In the weeks that followed, David tried to return to normal life, but no matter where he moved, he kept seeing glimpses of someone standing just outside his door at night. And each time he moved again, a letter would arrive at his new address. Always the same message: "We never really leave, David. We just become part of the story." It was then he realized he was now the one in the ad, and someone somewhere would soon read it. Sam was browsing Craigslist late one night when he came across an ad in the free stuff section. The title read, "Free antique doll. Comes with a history." Normally, he would scroll past anything involving dolls. They always had an eerie, vacant look to them that he hated. But something about this ad held his attention. He clicked on it. The ad's description was strange and unsettling. "This doll has been in my family for generations, but it needs a new home. My grandmother swore it was cursed, but I've never had any issues with it. Please only take it if you're serious. No calls afterward. If you change your mind, leave it outside your door overnight, and it'll be gone by morning." Sam thought it had to be a joke or maybe a clever marketing ploy. He was a skeptic and didn't believe in curses or ghosts. Besides, he had a friend's birthday coming up, and she loved weird old things. He could surprise her with the doll and tell her the spooky story that came with it. After all, it was free. The next day, Sam messaged the poster, who simply signed as L and arranged to pick up the doll. They left it outside their door for him, wrapped in a faded cloth. Sam took it home, chuckling at how easy it was to acquire something that supposedly carried a curse. At home, he unwrapped the doll, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling growing in his stomach. The doll was old, with glassy blue eyes that seemed to follow him around the room. Its face was cracked, with one side of the mouth chipped, making it look as though it were frozen in a half smile, half grimace. He set it on a shelf in his living room and tried not to stare at it. That night, he had strange dreams. He dreamed he was a little boy again, running through an endless field under a blood-red sky. He heard faint whispers behind him, laughter, then soft footsteps that were getting closer and closer. He ran as fast as he could, but his legs felt heavy, like he was running through molasses. Just as he was about to turn and see what was chasing him, he woke up, drenched in sweat, his heart pounding. He shook it off as just a bad dream, though he noticed that when he looked at the doll, it seemed to be positioned differently than before. Its head turned slightly as though it had been watching him. He blamed it on his imagination and went about his day, but the dreams kept coming. Each night, they grew worse. He saw himself trapped in a dark room, surrounded by dolls, all of them staring at him with those same lifeless eyes. They whispered things he couldn't understand, soft, angry murmurs that crawled under his skin. And every morning, he found the doll moved. Sometimes it was facing him from the couch. Other times it would be on the floor, lying down as if it had fallen. But Sam lived alone. No one else was there to move it. He tried to ignore it, telling himself he must have accidentally nudged it, even though deep down, he knew he hadn't. A few nights later, he couldn't take it anymore. He decided to return the doll. He remembered the part of the ad that said to leave it outside if he changed his mind. He wrapped it back up and placed it on his porch, relieved to be rid of it. The next morning, when he checked, the doll was gone. He laughed, a weight lifted from his shoulders. But that night, the dreams returned, more vivid than ever. This time, he was back in the dark room, surrounded by dolls, their whispers louder, clearer. He heard his name, chanted over and over in a mocking, childlike voice. He tried to scream, but nothing came out. And then, he woke up with a jolt. Panting, he reached for his phone to check the time. But there, on the nightstand beside him, was the doll, sitting upright, its head tilted, its glassy eyes staring directly into his. It hadn't been there when he went to sleep. Panicked, he threw it back in the cloth and drove miles out of town, tossing it into the river, watching as it floated away before finally disappearing. Feeling a strange mixture of relief and dread, he returned home. But the next night he woke up to the soft sound of a whisper, right by his ear. He froze, too afraid to move. He felt a small, cold hand brush against his cheek. With a shiver, he turned on his lamp, heart pounding, and there, on his bed, was the doll, soaking wet, mud dripping from its cracked face. In the days that followed, he tried everything he could think of. He tried burying it, burning it, and even destroying it with a hammer. But every time, the doll would return, undamaged, waiting for him on his nightstand. He stopped sleeping, too terrified to close his eyes, knowing he'd see it again, closer each time he did. The last time anyone heard from Sam, he had contacted Elle again, desperately asking how to get rid of the doll. But Elle only replied with a single message. Once you've taken it in, it stays with you. That's the price. No one has seen Sam since then, but every now and then a new Craigslist ad appears. Free antique doll, comes with a history. If you take it, do so only if you're serious. They say if you message the poster and mention Sam's name, you'll never get a reply. The ad was titled, Free House Sitting Opportunity, All Utilities Covered. Sarah couldn't believe her luck. After a messy breakup and barely scraping by on rent, this was her chance to catch a break. The posting promised free accommodation for 2 weeks, only requesting that she water the plants and feed the owner's cat, Marley. She emailed right away, and within an hour, she received a friendly reply from a woman named Miss Winfield. Winfield explained that her elderly mother had passed, and she needed someone to look after her late mother's house while she took care of family affairs out of town. I know it sounds silly, she wrote, but it brings me comfort knowing there's someone there. The day Sarah arrived at the house, Miss Winfield was already gone. She found the key under the doormat, just as Miss Winfield had instructed. The house was beautiful, though eerily quiet. As she walked through the rooms, she felt an odd sensation, like someone was watching her. But she brushed it off as nerves. After all, the house was huge, with high ceilings and shadowed corners. The first night passed quietly. Marley, a slender, jet-black cat, barely left her side. He would sit at the foot of her bed, watching her with his big yellow eyes as if he was guarding her. She thought it was sweet and found comfort in his presence. The second night, she woke to a soft sound, like scratching. She sat up, heart racing, and saw Marley staring intently at the bedroom door, his fur on end. She strained her ears but heard nothing. After a few tense minutes, Marley relaxed and curled up beside her again. Sarah figured it must have been an old house settling or maybe a stray animal outside. But the scratching returned, night after night. It grew louder, and each time Marley would growl, his gaze fixated on the door. On the fifth night, unable to sleep, she decided to investigate. She tiptoed down the hallway and toward the sound, which seemed to be coming from the basement. The basement door was locked, so she pulled out her phone and messaged Ms. Winfield, asking if there was something she should know. Miss Winfield's response was immediate. It's an old house, dear. Sometimes it sounds like it has a life of its own. Just ignore it, and it'll stop. That answer didn't sit right with her, but she didn't want to seem paranoid, so she forced herself back to bed. A few nights later, the scratching was joined by faint whispers, as if someone was murmuring just out of earshot. Sarah pressed her ear to the wall, trying to make out the words, but they were too soft, blending into an eerie rhythm with the scratching. Unable to sleep, Sarah started looking around the house, hoping to find something that would explain the noises. In the attic, she found boxes of old photos and letters, all labeled with the name Winfield. She flipped through them, feeling like she was intruding, but too curious to stop. The photos were black and white, most of them showing Miss Winfield's mother, her family, and an unfamiliar man who appeared in almost every photo. In each one, his face was turned away from the camera or hidden in shadows, so she couldn't make out his features. She discovered a stack of yellowed letters, bound together with a thin string. The letters were addressed to Mary, Miss Winfield's mother, but they were all unsigned. The handwriting was scrawled and frantic, filled with phrases like, "I know you hear me, and you can't keep me locked away forever." Sarah's hands trembled as she read the final letter, which ended with, "I will always find a way back to you." Just then she heard a loud, shuffling sound below her. Heart pounding, she put the letters back and descended the narrow attic stairs. Marley was sitting at the bottom, staring up at her with those intense yellow eyes. The following night, things took a sinister turn. As she lay in bed, she heard a soft click. She looked over to see the bedroom door slowly swinging open, revealing the dark hallway beyond. She felt a chill, and Marley hissed, his eyes fixed on the empty doorway. In a panic, Sarah grabbed her phone and texted Miss Winfield, begging for more information. "Please, just tell me what's in the basement. I keep hearing things. Are you sure I'm alone here?" There was a long pause before her phone buzzed with a reply. "Do not go into the basement. Whatever you hear, ignore it. I'll be back soon." The message did nothing to ease her nerves. That night, the scratching grew louder and more frantic. She could no longer ignore it. Marley was pacing by the door, growling softly. Feeling desperate, she took a deep breath, grabbed a flashlight, and headed toward the basement door. It was still locked, but she noticed a small silver key resting on a nearby table. Trembling, she inserted the key into the lock. The door creaked open, and a musty smell wafted up. She shone the flashlight down the stairs and saw a shape slumped in the far corner, draped in shadows. Her breath caught as the light fell on the figure. A man, his face twisted in anger, his eyes wide, staring straight at her. The figure took a step forward, and she stumbled back, slamming the door and locking it, her heart racing. She heard heavy footsteps pounding up the stairs, followed by frantic scratching as if he were clawing at the door. Sarah fled the house that night, refusing to return. She tried calling Miss Winfield, but her number had been disconnected. A few days later, Sarah checked Craigslist, curious to see if the ad was still up. To her horror, she found a new listing. Free house sitting opportunity. All utilities covered. 2-week stay required. Must water the plants and feed the cat. As she stared at the ad, her phone buzzed. She glanced down at the message notification, her stomach twisting. It was a message from Miss Winfield's number, though she knew it shouldn't have been possible. "I warned you, Sarah. I told you not to open that door." The text was followed by a photo, an image of the basement with the door wide open and the shadowed figure standing on the stairs, staring into the camera with a sinister, knowing smile. And just at the bottom of the image, barely visible, she could see Marley's unmistakable yellow eyes peering up from the darkness.